Seed oils have gotten a lot of attention lately.
Too many omega-6 fatty acids. They've been linked with certain types of inflammation.
I've gone on the record saying that too, but I've questioned if I can stand by what I said. I decided to go to an expert. And Bill Harris is a scientist who has studied fatty acids his whole career. If you look on the internet for experts in fatty acids, Bill's at the top.
You know, you and I have, we were on the faculty together for the University of South Dakota, and I have said goodbye to the plains of the Midwest and now live in Tampa, but I can't help but feel like a South Dakotan every day while I'm in Florida.
It's in your blood. That's right.
Amen.
That's right.
What I love about this guy is how humble he is.
Why don't you do some bragging for us and introduce us for how you are such an expert in fatty acids?
Right. The Codfather, right?
Yes, that's great.
See what I'm talking about?
Why are you an expert? I mean, you just get on a horse and just keep riding it until it dies, and this one didn't die, and this one just keeps riding along.
And thank God it improves longevity because you're still around and still kicking and still putting out research.
Right. That's right, and I think that's partly right. Exactly. So I'm coming on 76, and still feel good, still working, and yada yada.
May we all be so blessed. That's amazing.
You can understand how I worked with this guy for years, not appreciating how powerful his work and research was.
Top 1% was some of the stuff I was reading. Is that true?
Well, yeah. I mean, you're right. There's some guys from UC San Francisco who tried to figure out a way to rank impact,
right?
Scientific impact, which is an interesting idea. And all of us are egoists. Like, we all have egos. We want to be impactful. So they came up with these metrics and who all is citing your papers when they write their papers.
Right.
When are you cited? Things like that. And so they did this for like 200,000 scientists over the last 50, 60 years. And I came in like in 1.8% of the top. I mean, I got an A.
That's fantastic.
It was, I mean, but it's a little bit disingenuous. Yeah, in my little world, my little omega-3 world, it's been impactful. It's just the fact that omega-3s have attracted so much attention from so many people that omega-3s themselves they're like the fifth most published or most researched molecule in life. But, I always take this, impactful thing with a grain of salt because my score in that is higher than Watson and Crick.
That's funny. Okay.
I mean,
no, but
we probably had an impact. Those guys are, even the discoverer of omega-3, Jorn Dyerberg, a Danish doctor, I have a higher impact score than he does, but he was I wouldn't be anything if he hadn't discovered the omega-3s.
All right. So our story started about a half a dozen years ago when I was looking for answers again and turned to Bill.
We had an argument or we had a disagreement, and I will not give it away.
What did we disagree about?
Well, you gave me an assignment that was like a stack of papers like this tall. And it might have taken me a couple years to get through them. I chipped away at them long and hard to say, why does the social world of medicine and my patients have this disdain for seed oils? And then we had a discussion about, well, let's go to the evidence about that. Now, we're going to talk about that, but I don't want to start there. So that's just kind of a teaser.
To get started with this omega-3, omega-6 debate, we need to begin with what is omega-3?
Why do we call these things omega anything?
Okay.
Where did that name ever come from?
Bill goes on and on about his favorite molecule, about omega-3. But let me summarize. You have these long chains of fat. These are carbon atoms, and there is a double bond in multiple places. This is polyunsaturated fatty acids, poly double bonds. Go to the end of the alphabet, the omega, not the alpha, the omega. And from the omega, you're going to count 6 carbons to find the omega-6s, and you'll count 3 carbons to find the omega-3s. It's at those numbers that you will have double bonds in these fatty acids.
We have lots of human study evidence that this is a predictor of health and disease. Omega-3 is a test that you study in your lab, but how did you get to be interested in that and put so many years of research behind this marker?
Well, the marker, so I've been interested in omega-3 really the first 20 or so years of my career. I was doing studies on, what's the effect of giving fish oils to people on LDL, HDL, triglycerides, platelet function, blood clotting, and all that. So those were intervention studies. We actually randomized people to placebo or fish oil and then see what happens. I think really just after the turn of the century, I was at a meeting with a colleague at American Heart Association in Chicago. I do remember it was in 2002. And a paper was presented by a group from Harvard that looked at the blood omega-3, really the red blood cell, the omega-3 level as a predictor of risk for sudden cardiac death. And it was a prospective study, meaning that they had blood frozen away from a large number of healthy people, healthy men, as it turned out, who were in part of the physician's health study. And they had the blood stored away from baseline when they first entered the study, and they were healthy, no cancer, no heart disease, et cetera. And then after 17 years of waiting around, not just waiting for this, but they realized they had like 100 or so cases of sudden cardiac death in this group. So the idea had been out there from some other studies that omega-3s might reduce risk for sudden death, sudden cardiac death, which is typically a ventricular arrhythmia, a fatal arrhythmia, not atrial fibrillation. It's ventricular fibrillation, bigger deal.
Right.
So they had this idea. So the researchers went to the freezer, pulled out the blood samples of these guys who had died, pulled out twice as many blood samples from guys who were the same age and same race and same BMI, and all that, tried to match them, but had not experienced sudden cardiac death, and analyzed the omega-3 levels in both and found that the people who had the lowest omega-3s were the most likely to have died, and the ones that had the highest omega-3s were the ones that were the least likely to die. And it was like 90% lower risk of being a sudden cardiac disease case if you're on the highest quartile of omega-3. Well, anyway, paper is published, New England Journal paper. I'm sitting with my colleague, Clemens von Schacke from Munich, and we're talking about this paper. We're both interested in omega-3, and we said that, this blood marker means something.
Right.
It's not just a marker of how much fish are you eating, use it in an epidemiologic study. This really is a risk factor. Even more than cholesterol, probably. We didn't know that at the time. Right. But it predicts risk, and if you modify it, it changes risk. And so that's a definition of a risk factor. And the thing that's so nice about it is so easily modifiable by diet, supplementation, if you want to. You don't have to take drugs. Some risk factors you can't do anything about.
Right. I mean,
X.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and those are huge. And there's a bunch of other little things: your blood pressure, your cholesterol levels, your smoking, whether you have diabetes. You can work on those things. But the omega-3 index is something that's very easy to change, and it's just as much a predictor as those other things are. So why aren't we using it? Because there's no test. And so we decided there needs to be a test. So we spent about a year or two writing up a paper with the rationale for why a test would be important and what the cut points would be. And we named it the omega-3 index. Didn't think a lot about it, just said, why not? And published a paper in 2004 on the idea of an omega-3 index being a risk factor for fatal coronary disease. That was the focus at the time. And at that point, we picked a omega-3 index of 80% and above as being healthy target. and 4% and below is the place you don't want to be. And there's kind of an intermediate zone in the middle. And over the last 20 years, that's pretty well played out. Those cut points are still pretty valid. So it usually runs somewhere between 2% and 12%.
Yeah.
With most people in America right around 5-ish.
And a couple of things that I love about your test, the test that is something I could order as a physician, but more importantly is the season of life that I think medicine is headed towards. It's how do you empower the patient to check something that we have really good confidence in, unlike LDL, which could take 4 years of medical school to really explain why it's higher and a higher risk factor here and lower and not so much of a risk factor here. Omega-3 really does have a brilliant correlation to long-term health. And the patient should be the one measuring it. The patient should take ownership of what is your number and what are you doing to get it better.
Right. And the fact that it is nutritionally approached or fixed, you don't need a prescription from a doctor to do that.
Right.
Just follow the instructions and eat more omega-3, eat more fish, take more supplements, and the omega-3 index will go up. And
you got 20 years of now seeing this marker, being able to look at it, using your epidemiology hat. So what are some of the shocking things that you said, I wouldn't have expected this to be such a predictor of that disease?
I'm kind of not surprised anymore to anything.
Okay, fair.
But I mean, from the beginning, it was cardiovascular. That was the primary point of the omega-3s. And then we started seeing relationships with dementia and depression, low levels, increasing risk. It's always that way. Then lately we start seeing things about like risk for fracture. And we looked at total mortality. We looked at that, which is really the most important.
Yeah.
Or one of the most important metrics is, are you alive or dead? Do you live longer or shorter? And we found the omega-3, higher omega-3 associated with longer life.
Well, as a physician, I mean, I've had many times where I think we had a good plan. This is what the rules were. And they were measuring a surrogate of sorts or a predictor or, this is how the parameters of a study were set up. And then a decade later, I don't get to say those words anymore because that wasn't the right thing to be studying. So when you measure life and death, it's really hard to screw it up.
Well, that's true. As we say, it's very easy to adjudicate the end point.
Amen. Yeah, right.
Decide, did this guy have a heart attack or was this just heartburn? I'm not quite sure, but
yeah.
Alive or dead, easy.
Bill is uniquely qualified to have this advanced discussion, and his love and passion for omega-3 is contagious. But what I'm really struck by is how healthy his brain is. That's what I want to look like at 76. So as his favorite molecule comes under fire in the media once again, I want to see where's the evidence that he's right.
Take a second to explain the major banks of information and where you guys are getting most of your samples from and what either were the studies that are most impressive to you or maybe there's a few that are underway that you're curious about their outcomes.
Yeah, the sources of our data are what they call prospective observational studies. It's epidemiology, it's studying people and populations. And the classic one that many people know about is called the Framingham study.
Yep.
And Framingham heart study was probably the first major prospective, meaning forward-looking.
Yep.
Observational, so we're going to observe people. We're not going to intervene. We're not going to give them, treat them with something. We're just going to let them live life. Of course, they're all going to get sick. They're going to take drugs, yada, 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 over time. But we just want to observe them. And so those studies usually start off with a baseline examination of the person, where they find out what their diet is, what's their blood pressure, what's their cholesterol, what's their, how much did they weigh, how old are they, what sex are they, yada, yada, yada. And then based on that information, you then watch, and this all came about, it's a bit of a rabbit trail, but why the Framingham heart study? Because this is 1948. And typically men were just falling over dead of heart attacks in their late 40s and 50s, and nobody knew why. They didn't. The idea of a risk factor has not been invented. Nobody knew what a risk factor meant in those days. So this Framingham study was undertaken to see, well, what are the things that predict? How can we predict who's going to have a heart attack? And it turns out, the guys, if you look back 7 or 8 years after the thing started, it's the guys who have high blood pressure that are having heart attacks.
All right, that was the first one.
It's the guys who are smoking that are having, it's the guys who have a high cholesterol level that are having heart attacks. So this is how we begin to discover what are these factors that lead. The diabetic guys, they're having heart attacks, So that's the Framingham study. That's an observational cohort study. So this has been replicated hundreds of times around the world, all kinds of the same idea. Recruit a bunch of healthy people and then measure the heck out of them and then watch them all the time.
Expect them to be as messy as humans are and then be able to put their messiness into lanes where you can try to sort. Is that messiness the one you have, or do you have both of those?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's not as clean. I mean, the medical world loves a randomized control trial with a placebo.
Oh, boy.
It lasts, 3, 4, 5 years. And that's the way you prove a drug or treatment works or not. Well, that's very limited when you're talking about a lifetime of nutrition.
Yeah.
You can't do that. So these observational studies are much more helpful for understanding dietary factors that can affect disease outcomes. So in any event, we use the Framingham study. Actually, there's one called the Framingham Offspring, where the people who, the kids, they're from the original study from the 1940s. In the 1970s, they started a new study with kids called the Offspring. And we measured the omega-3 index in the Offspring. And then much of our work has been looking at what happened as a function of omega-3 levels, who got what disease when. And so that's been a good one. We've also worked a lot in a thing called the Women's Health Initiative memory study. So Women's Health Initiative was a very big study, but the memory study was very focused on measuring cognitive function. And so we measured all the omega-3 levels in those women and have got several papers about dementia, et cetera, and cognitive loss and things like that, plus MRIs or measurements of the brain's size and structure and related to omega-3. So those have been two. Most recently, we've been involved with a prospective observational study called the UK Biobank.
Yes, I wish about this. Yes.
Yeah, in the United States, it was in England, Scotland, Wales. And they, about now 12 years ago, they undertook very much like the Framingham. They recruited, except they didn't just recruit 4,000 people, they recruited 450,000.
It's crazy, the amount. Its number is huge. Yeah.
It's huge. But what's efficient about this study is, in studies like Framingham, they're very expensive because every 2 or 3 years, you have to reach out and bring every individual participant back to go through another bunch of tests, interviews and diet records and all this kind of stuff. It's very intensive and it's expensive.
Yeah.
So if you do it every 2 years, it adds up. But what they're doing in the UK Biobank, because everybody is in the National Health Registry, all the medical records of everybody are collected by the government. So what they've done here is they say, okay, that's available to researchers. It's all anonymous, of course. You don't know who's who. But you can get data on 450,000 people, and one of the questions that's relevant to this talk is one of the questions they asked them at the baseline was, do you take fish oil supplements or not? Simple question. Doesn't say how much, doesn't say what kind, doesn't say how faithful you are. It's just your opinion, yes, no. Well, there have now been, I think, 17 papers published using that as the fulcrum of the question. Do people who report taking fish oil supplements have more or less of this disease, that disease, that disease, that disease, down the road? And interestingly, virtually every time they find sometimes there's no relationship, partly because do you take fish oil supplements or not is not a very precise question.
Right. Yeah.
Doesn't tell you much of anything about their blood levels, right? But nevertheless, it's something. It's not nothing. And I think there were like 40 different statistically significant relationships between the people that take fish oil supplements and those who don't on some disease outcome. So 40 different statistics. And every one of them, except one, was favorable.
Wow.
For fish oil supplement users.
So
The one, yeah, I mean, excuse me,
the one that wasn't was what?
AFib.
Oh,
AFib.
yeah, right. Which is just messy. This is messy.
Well, and we think we have a explanation for why that one should not be adverse.
Right.
At worst, it's neutral.
Right. That's what I tell patients too. This is exactly where I wanted that authority to come out. So thank you for telling that story, because as you talk with patients, and praise God, the echo chambers here on YouTube have really improved. But as you field questions and try to give gravity for places in medicine where the evidence is so powerful, you wish you could have a like I don't know, a neon sign on the video that says, no, this part that we're talking about, this has powerful evidence for predicting what it is you're after. And again, most of the patients that tune into the channel that I lead they're looking for the best life. They've struggled in the past with weight usually, but they've also had, I'm an internist, we collect problems. They've got one of them, and they want to get rid of the prescriptions that go with those problems. And so then they will hear different things on the internet and try to say, well, here's what this, and it's usually marketing, says. And then it becomes a war. Like, well, this paper says, and you're like, you're stacking up against something like omega-3, which to put it into a bullet point and allow them to absorb how heavy that evidence is that this marker really is one of the most important things you should be watching.
All right, so now the conversation gets into the good stuff. We're going to get into the seed oils and omega-6. Stay tuned.
The two families, omega-6 and omega-3, the omega-6s typically come from plant sources. Really, in our diet, we can get them from eating meat, but there's very little.
Very little.
Meat.
Okay.
It's mostly in processed foods like fried foods, or it's in chicken where they feed omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids, seed oils to chickens. We eat a lot of chicken. And of course, salad dressing and things like that. So the omega-6, and there's the primary ones called linoleic acid.
Mm-hmm.
Linoleic acid is the most common, actually, it's the highest fatty acid of any fatty acid in our blood. It's number one. Okay, great. And we get most of it ultimately from seed oils, because corn oil, soybean oil, particularly soybean oil, they're 50 to 70% of the oil is linoleic acid. And so when you have different levels of linoleic acid in your blood, it's from your diet. It's someplace it can come from.
Right.
And so, yeah, seed oils have been getting a lot. Do you want to chase down the seed oil?
That's totally where I want to go with this. Like that's the assignment you gave me about 8 years ago, maybe now.
Yeah. Well, it's just gotten better. Well, there was for many years, people have known, like in the cardiovascular world, if you take people's diet and if you take butter and lard and tallow out of their diet and you give them corn oil,
right,
soybean oil, their cholesterol level goes down. Happens every time. And so people were told to take more vegetable oils and eat less of the butters, which is where we got going into margarines and things like that, soft spreads. Was an attempt to get rid of the saturated fat with the hard fat from animals and go to and that helped, that lowered cholesterol. Well, since cholesterol has always been thought to be the most important risk factor for heart disease, or one of them, it went from lower cholesterol must mean lower heart disease rate. Well, okay, it doesn't always work that way. But what we have seen is that the omega-6 has kind of got a bad name. Pretty much, they got a bad name probably starting with the omega-3 discovery, because we discovered that omega-6 and omega-3 are kind of like on a seesaw.
Right, a ratio, right?
Yeah, kind of a ratio, and they compete for the same metabolic pathways for conversion to other important
Yeah, right.
substrates. Right. And so the omega-6s were thought to be pro-inflammatory,
Mm-hmm.
because some of the metabolites that come from omega-6 are fine. But you need some inflammation.
Yeah.
It's a good thing, but it's just not, we just don't want it chronically. And the omega-3s were much less active in producing inflammation. So it was always this balance of, you want to have higher omega-3, lower omega-6. But that was kind of too simple, because out of that idea grew this omega-6, omega-3 ratio, which people love, which I don't love, because I think it is a confusing ratio, and it's not very precise, and it can mislead you very extremely. And part of the reason it can mislead is because people will say, I need to lower my omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Well, how do you do that? Well, how do you do that with any ratio? You either change the denominator or the numerator.
Right, yep. One or the other.
You eat less of the omega-6, more of the omega-3. Well, they think if they got a bad ratio, they can just eat less omega-6, and they don't have to do anything about the omega-3, and they think they're going to be better off. Well, they're not going to be better off. That ratio, unfortunately, doesn't focus on the real problem, which is the lack of omega-3.
Right, right.
It's not the presence of the omega-6 that's the problem. In fact, we have seen most published recently that when you look at blood levels of omega-6, the linolic acid, the one that's in the diet, the one that it's the most common polyunsaturated fatty acid in the diet. If you look at different blood levels in people, and then again we've done this now with the UK Biobank with some 250,000 people. We looked at their blood linolic acid levels, and we ranked them from the lowest to the highest in quintiles, 20%, 20%. And then we looked at their risk for death over about 12 years after we measured the blood sample.
Okay.
And we found that, lo and behold, the people that have the highest linolic acid are the most likely to still be alive.
Yeah, this is where it got confusing.
This is what really tripped me up about that stack of scientific papers that Bill handed me. Like Bill mentioned, omega-6s are pro-inflammatory, so theoretically, too much of them could be a bad thing. Too much inflammation was causing several problems in my patients. And if seed oils are filled with omega-6s, then the seed oils must be the bad guy. But I couldn't find the evidence that omega-6s were causing harm, or that reducing them improved your health. In fact, these papers were saying the exact opposite.
Many of these observational prospective studies do a dietary survey, food frequency questionnaire or 24-hour recall, something like that, to get some idea what people are eating.
Right.
And it's imprecise, but it's not terrible. I mean, it's not useless. It's just not as precise as a blood level measurement.
Yep.
And those studies have long reported that if you look at all of them in the aggregate and you look at the people who are reporting the highest intake of linolic acid, omega-6, versus the lowest, the highest people in the highest intake levels are having less heart disease, less diabetes, less cancer. They're doing better. They're living longer.
Right.
So the omega-6s are not bad. Linolic is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. We need to continue to eat at least as much as we're eating now. There's a lot of people trying to eat omegas, eat less. And I think that's going to be very bad.
Over the years, I've come back to this topic, adding to my knowledge bank, trying to make sure I understand what does the evidence say. But I keep getting disappointed over and over again.
The human body's ability to tell where that linoleic acid came from. Like a seed oil, whether it comes from safflower oil or corn oil or sunflowers, the oil itself is going to be registered or recognized by our body because of its size, shape, length, and that, 6 carbon from the end being double bonded. Where it came from isn't something your body can recognize. And so
Right.
when there is a wild and a vitriol hatred for seed oils, like I'm not touching it, it's going to hurt me.
People will show, I watch these YouTube things that just pull, obviously I pulled my hair out. I mean, what do you get?
You're there.
And they'll show graphs of, here is the intake in 1909 of seed oils, and it was way down here. And then we developed processes of extracting seed oils, and when the intake is going, it's going so high. And then they'll lay up against that, like, the rate of heart disease, except it doesn't really work because that's dropped off from the seed oil still. But anyway, they'll try to link some idea that we're sicker and sicker and sicker because of this relationship.
It's easy for me to go there. Hunters and gatherers had no processed foods and no seed oils, but that omega-6 is essential, so they were getting it somewhere. So it must be from these non-processed foods, and then you only want so much of it. More is not better. But that's not what the evidence is saying.
Association does not mean causation. But that's one of and they do it country after country after country, and it doesn't mean anything.
I don't particularly like the idea of a seed oil. I have seen the, very fascinating process of how we extract oil from something that is corn. And I grew up in South Dakota. That's how my dad paid for me to go to, college. I mean, I get it.
Right.
It's our home roots. That's George McGovern and his mixed up food pyramid is our senator, right? Yeah. And I have really tried to say, let's look at, can your body, really measure that increased C-reactive protein or inflammatory markers of, everything from ferritin to homocysteine, the things that, yes, we have these correlations that do increase and predict heart disease. Are they correlated when the processed food stays the same, but the seed oil was present? And I can't seem to find a clear answer for that. Have you come across a way to separate that in your mind?
I guess what you're saying is, is it the company that they keep?
Right.
What's the problem? Is it the ultra processed foods that happen to have seed oils in them?
Right.
And the problem is whatever's toxic or whatever's adverse is something about the processed food. It doesn't have to be the seed oil. That's not logical.
Right.
It doesn't have to flow that way. In fact, and the higher, what's interesting is, since most of the seed oil we consume, it probably is in some kind of processed food, the fact that there's higher levels of linoleic acid in our blood, and those are good for us. If that's a marker of processed food intake, the whole paradigm of processed foods are what's killing us kind of falls apart, because here's a marker of the intake. We haven't got many good markers of intake of processed foods. One of them is linoleic acid, because it's in the seed oil, it's in the processed food, but we're seeing that higher levels are beneficial.
Right.
Are Bill and I saying that eat processed foods, that's okay, there's no problem here? No, we are not saying that. That's silly. That's that correlation that eating processed foods high in omega-6 is good for you? No, that's a problem with a correlation, right? Is that there's a missing component somewhere.
And then along comes the ketogenic diet, where we put fat much higher in their diet. We really take down the carbohydrates. And of course, the processed food part in my mind is still part of this. Like, how does that fit in? Is a hot dog processed food? I had to, kind of work through that. Is bologna processed food? Because it's high in fat. It's got some salt. There are some things I don't want in there, but they're pretty ketogenic. If you're going to say be on a ketogenic diet, that's going to be on their menu. Have some pepperoni, right? And as I watched patients over time, over those, especially those first 3 years, it was mind blowing that I'm telling them, yeah, I know I've told you not to eat butter or lard, but the fats aren't where I'm going to have you focus. I'm going to take those carbohydrates way down, because Well, frankly, you've had enough of them for a lifetime. We need to not do that. And that fat and protein really became this white horse of patients not only having a lot of improvement in their inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, ferritin, homocysteine, all the things that, yes, they're independent markers for, is this patient going to have a heart attack? Set aside LDL cholesterol, because you're eating mostly fat, their cholesterols went up. And by golly, so did their omega-6. And so did, now you've got this next demon. I mean, even when I have patients say, let's just have you try to reset your hunger. We're going to have you eat sardines for only 3 days. And one of the biggest, if you Google sardines in my name, you'll see that I've put this challenge to a lot of patients. But even a pushback that has come over the last 3 years is, but it's in olive oil. And although olive is a fruit, that's not a seed, they'll tell me, yes, but that olive oil isn't pure and there's seed oils in that can of sardines. And I'm like, you have missed the forest for that tree.
Well, especially right. Not only is olive oil not a seed oil, but it's very low in omega-6.
Yeah, exactly. So now you've got
right.
All right, so let's get back to that original debate that started years ago.
And the day that I came in and we had this like I was expecting you to completely agree with me. And you handed me this pile of papers where I'd clearly been reading the papers I wanted to agree with me. And 2.5 years later, I'm like, well, snap, this is not very easy. There is plenty of data that says when omega-6 is higher, when fats circulate in a human body, the health is better. And does that mean it's ketogenic? We could debate that. But what it does mean is you cannot demonize these seed oils, because your body can't tell the difference from where that omega-6 came from and whether it was processed in a way. There might be something else in there, but there isn't really good evidence that I've read that says, throw the seed oils out with that baby. We're giving up on that. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen good evidence that you should do that. Not at all.
Right.
On the contrary. I mean, I think that's going to be harmful.
Yeah.
Maybe like the trans fat all over again.
Yeah, trans fats we've had to give up on because I don't think we're going to get a good.
But back in the 70s, they were. That's pretty great. We can give foods the mouthfeel of a saturated fat. Saturated fats are terrible. We can do that with this partial hydrogenation, make some trans fats, and people did studies on them, and they looked good. There was no problem. This was great until there was a problem.
Right.
And I think people who are trying to get rid of omega-6 out of our diet, who are trying to limit seed oils, are going to someday find out that, if we just looked at the research, we'd realize we're more likely to get diabetes or heart disease if we do that.
Right.
So what do I believe now? It's hard for me to even give a straight answer on this. The evidence says that omega-6s are not bad, and the source of those coming from seed oils seems to be everywhere in our grocery stores. I'm not going to add them back to my menu, but I also am not going to have a fit when I see them in some of the ingredients where I just don't have control over that. So here's my advice to you.
Start with adding some little fish in your life and know that it's a first world problem if you've never eaten them and you don't like the taste of them. Palates are adaptable. Welcome to being adult. But also that if they have seed oils in the can as well, quit it. Quit focusing on that. That's not, there isn't evidence that little bit of seed oil there is going to counteract this if you're in a place where the inflammation in your whole body is lower.
My brain is still not settled on this, and I have an interview coming up with the other side. If you like this debate and several others that I've struggled with, please subscribe.